Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Chronograde Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're asking the question of what if Catalonia became independent? Right, so this video has been suggested by one of my personal, very close mates, Didge, and yeah, he suggested this many months ago, and yeah, I finally got round to actually doing this, right? So anyway, big shout out to my man, right? But anyway, with regard to this video, so yeah, we're going to be looking at obviously the history of it. We're going to give a lot of the context, just so we understand, because a lot of people might not necessarily understand all the history and stuff, so that's what we're going to look into in this video. But before we do all that, don't forget to obviously hit the like button, share with your friends, sharing is caring, and also as well, you, I haven't done one of these for a while, right? But if you're watching this video and you haven't subscribed yet, you know what to do. Scroll down, yeah, hit the red button, and yeah, subscribe. We've got a whole lot of videos coming, and yeah, there's a whole much more that we've done, so definitely hit the subscribe button, and that will really help me out and stuff, right? So anyway, back to the video. So with this video, we're going to start all the way back to the days of the ancient Romans, right? So obviously the Romans had control over a large swathe of territory, and obviously not everyone in every single part of the empire spoke Latin as the Romans would speak it, right? So, you know, this ended up becoming mixed in with like some of the local languages, also some different dialects, etc., etc. So as a result, you end up having what's known as Vulgar Latin, right? And Vulgar Latin over the centuries end up evolving into the different Romance languages. So obviously you have French, you have Occitan, you have Romanian, you have Italian, etc., etc. But then within the Iberian Peninsula, so basically, you know, Spain and Portugal, right? You end up obviously having Portuguese, you end up having Castilian, you end up having Leonese, you end up having Aragonese, Galician, Asturian, you end up having, I think I've named all of them now. And yeah, of course, you're having Catalan, right? So Catalan, I'm sorry if I've missed any of yours, it is what it is, right? But anyway, so Catalan, that's the main focus for this video, right? So most times when we think about Spanish, it's actually Castilian Spanish that we speak of, right? So Catalonian is actually closer to Occitan, which is spoken in the south of France. So this is kind of the beginning of where there's a bit of a difference, right? And then also as well, don't forget that you end up having Charlemagne, right? And he was the king of the Franks. So, you know, Francia. You know, so basically he ended up eventually leading to like the creation of like what today is France. But part of the conquest that he made also extended into what's known as the Spanish Marches, right? So the Spanish Marches in today's like lingo is basically what is basically the area of like Catalonia today. So like, so you're having, you know, Barcelona, which was controlled by him as well. And so again, this is very separate from the rest of Spain, which at that time was controlled by the Muslims, yeah, who were, you know, the Moors from North Africa, you know, who like conquered much of that region, right? And so fast forward a few centuries, you end up having the Principality of Catalonia, right? So the Principality of Catalonia was in a personal union with the Kingdom of Aragon, right? And this personal union continued from 1162 all the way until 1641, right? So, you know, we're going to talk a little bit later about the union of Catalonia with like the rest of Spain, but just understand that, you know, Aragon, you know, which was what Catalonia was a part of, it had been again separate and independent and maintained its independence for a long time, right? So during this time, you're having the county of Barcelona, and of course, obviously, the Kingdom of Aragon also controlled a vast swathe of territory throughout the Mediterranean. So it's known as a thalassocracy. I think I pronounced that correctly. So it's basically a maritime empire, right? So it's stretching all the way out into the rest of the Mediterranean, right? So again, like the culture there is very different. It's very much more interconnected with the rest of, you know, like the Mediterranean region rather than just what Castile is. And so the difference between Aragon and the rest of Spain is again entrenched once again. Now fast forward now to 1469, and you end up having the personal union, you know, so the marriage between Queen Isabella of Castile and Leon and King Ferdinand of the Kingdom of Aragon, right? So this is the first time when we have the creation of a nation which we call Spain, right? And it's because of the merging between these two kingdoms. Although it's something to note that although they united, it still didn't mean that like they just became one country and that was it, right? Each place still had its own separate laws and its own separate institutions, right? So Aragon, which is, you know, what Catalonia is partly made of, right? it was still able to have its own like way of like running things, right? So again, separate, right? This is the point I'm trying to express for all this history, separate, right? But anyway, so during this time, obviously, this is part of the Reconquista. So this is when the Christians are pushing the Muslims further down south, and eventually they kick them out of Spain in 1492. And it was also through this personal union that you end up having, Christopher Columbus, who's paid by Isabella and Ferdinand to basically, do his voyage. So in 1492, obviously, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and this is when he discovered the Americas. So Spain, as a result, end up becoming more powerful, and obviously having the Spanish Empire. And so the two regions were kind of united for the most part, because of like this empire, right? However, there's also something to note that what Spain ended up doing with that money, all the silver it got from South America and all the gold it got, etc., etc. It used that money to basically fund religious wars, which is basically part of the Counter-Reformation, right? So, for instance, you're having the 30 Years' War in Germany, which is 1618 to 1648, and the Spanish were very heavily involved in this. And so, during this time, you're not having Castilian troops marching through Aragon, right? And the peasants there very incensed by this, and they basically end up doing an uprising, right? So it's peasants revolt basically, and this became known as the Reapers' War, right? So the Reapers' War, it's because they have like these what they call scythes. I'm not like a great expert when it comes to kind of things, but like they had these scythes, and they used them basically, obviously for farming, but they turned these into weapons, during this rebellion. And during this time, Catalonia ended up basically becoming independent in a way, right? Or at least Aragon became independent. And while they were independent, they actually allowed the French king, who was Louis the 13th at that point, I believe. There's lots of Louis in the French monarchy, right? But anyway, he ended up becoming the Count of Barcelona. And so, again, there's a separation between Catalonia and the rest of Spain. Now, obviously, at the end of this Reapers' War, Spain end up conquering Catalonia. But again, we keep seeing the same pattern throughout the history, and we're going to get onto this as we keep going on, right? So, for instance, fast forward now, and it's the War of Spanish Succession. So this is 1701 until 1714. This is when all the different countries in Europe end up being involved in who's going to take over the Spanish monarchy. Because, if it ends up going towards the Bourbons, then, France and Spain end up basically kind of being like very united and stuff. If it ends up going to the Habsburgs, then also they end up being like very powerful as well, right? Because the Habsburgs are mainly in Austria, so there ends up being this kind of big balance of power struggle and stuff, right? But this struggle was also felt within Spain itself, because the most of Spain end up wanting it to be a Bourbon who was put on the throne, whereas Catalonia wanted it to be an Austrian on the throne, right? And actually, out of interest, the Spanish War of Succession end up kind of coming out of inbreeding and the results of it. I won't go into the ins and outs of it, but like this is the best argument ever for not being like, not for not doing incest, right? Just look at this guy. Anyway, back to the point. So during this time, Catalonia ends up splitting away from Spain again, and it's not until 1714, with the siege of Barcelona, that it ends up being crushed, right? And actually, the day in which this was crushed, which was the 11th of September, is still referred to by the Catalans as La Diada, which is like their national day, right? So the national day of Catalonia, which still commemorated to this day. That's because of the siege of Barcelona in 1714. Now, obviously, Spain was starting to get quite annoyed with Catalonia at this point, because it always kept trying to break away. And so there was a series of laws which ended up kind of being put in place, and this really repressed Catalan culture and removed it from like the courts, removed it from other things as well, etc. And also really clamped down on people being able to even like freely speak it like in public, right? And like this was the point at which Catalan laws and institutions, which up to this point had been separate from the rest of Spain, this is when they end up being got rid of, and they end up being basically a united Spain, right? So you kind of will see this pattern again played out, right? Where there ends up being a repression of Catalan culture by the government in Madrid. So anyway, fast forward now, and you've got the Napoleonic Wars, and France during this time end up obviously invading Spain, but they also took over the region of Catalonia, and basically instead of having it as Spain was basically a puppet which Napoleon's brother like kind of put on the throne, but Catalonia itself was put as part of France itself, so officially part of the French Empire. So again, there's this separation between Catalonia and the rest of Spain. So now fast forward now, obviously Spain ends up being like reunited, etc. at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, but then you're having more dynastic struggles, more conflict about this, right? And this leads to the three Carlist Wars, right, which took place over the course of the 19th century. So the first Carlist War was in 1833 and it ended in 1840. The second Carlist War was 1846 up until 1849. And then the third and final Carlist War was 1872 and it ended in 1876, right? So you're starting to see a bit of a pattern here whereby, there ends up being these kind of debates, there ends up being these kind of, well, not debates, there ends up being these wars about Spanish monarchy and stuff, right? And in each of these three cases, the Catalans are the ones who are in support of the Carlist, right? And so the Spanish throne is being contested, and they keep backing one side, and the one side they end up picking are the kind of more liberal side, and they're the ones who are promising that the Catalans will have their independent, or not necessarily their independence, they'll have more autonomy, and they will have much less repression of their language and of their culture. And by the time of the third and final Carlist War, this is when you're having a rise in republicanism, right? So the first Spanish Republic, end up, being set up during this time. But then in 1874, the Spanish monarchy ends up being restored, and this ends up leading to an increase in the call for Catalan independence and also for republicanism within Catalan. And it was also during this time when you're having a lot of industrialization, especially over in Catalonia itself. So Catalonia, especially Barcelona, end up becoming much more industrialized than the rest of Spain. However, obviously with this industrialization, you end up having an influx of people from like outside of Catalonia, and they end up obviously settling in Barcelona, right? So that's why even to this day, there are some people, even within Barcelona, who are more skeptical of Catalan independence and feel a closer connection to Spain because obviously they come from other parts of Spain. But during this time also you're having the Renaissance, I think that's how you pronounce it in Catalan. My pronunciation of any language is terrible, but especially languages I've never really heard before, right? But anyway, back to the point. So this is basically Renaissance, right? So this is when especially people in like the middle classes, they end up having a revived sense of Catalan nationalism, right? Because as we discussed with the video on the revolutions of 1848, during this time in most of Europe, right, nationalism tended to be a thing which was pushed more by the liberal people, especially those from like the middle classes, right? Which is quite strange because nowadays the liberals tend to be more skeptical of nationalism and tend to be more for internationalism. But in those days, they were really the pioneers when it came to nationalism, right? So you end up having an explosion of like Catalan culture and stuff. And also during this time, there was a lot less repression than there had been in prior times. So you end up having more books, you end up having more literature, etc., coming from the Catalans, right? So in 1931, you end up having the establishment of the Spanish Republic, right, the Second Spanish Republic, and also during this time, you end up having the Catalan Republic end up being declared, right? So again, there's a big push for republicanism, and especially within Catalonia itself. However, fast forward now and it's 1936, you're having the Spanish Civil War, right? And this is when General Franco end up, trying to overthrow the Republican government, and eventually he ended up succeeding, but it took 3 years of like very bloody civil war to take place, right? And in January of 1939, you end up having the crushing of Barcelona, then so the fall of Barcelona, and then a few months later, you end up having the fall of Madrid. But when Franco took over, right, what he did is he went back to this old thing of like repressing Catalan, right? And obviously, he was very, very harsh with this kind of stuff, right? So even people like speaking it, like, if you overheard speaking Catalan, even like there'd be consequences to that, right? So books, like everything, like anything that was done in Catalan, completely destroyed, people be arrested, etc. Right? So a really, really harsh like repression. And so the Francoist era was from 1939 up until 1975. So when he dies in 1975, a few years later, in 1978, you're not having the restoration of the monarchy, right? And during this time, there's a new constitution which is in place in Spain. However, while this constitution does give a lot of like autonomy to the different autonomous regions, so Catalonia is given a large degree of like its own independence, it explicitly says within that constitution that regions cannot like try and get their own independence, right? They can't vote for the independence, etc. This is all unconstitutional. Now, this obviously, as we've discussed in our previous videos where we're talking about like independence movements, whether it's like the American independence, whether it's Irish independence, whether it's to an extent Brexit, whether it's the Biafrans. Now, in all these kind of cases, right, the regions wanting to get independent, they are not too bothered about what's constitutional and stuff. And also as well, it's something to note that obviously the constitution, it's kind of a catch-22, right? Because the constitution is being put in place by people who are predominantly not of that region, right? And so, if you want to split away, if you have to go through a constitutional route, there's no way of changing it constitutionally because you're just not going to get enough votes for it, right? And so you're then forced to then go through an unconstitutional route, and then the people go, see, you're being unconstitutional. But it's kind of, they don't really have a choice in the matter. They're kind of like stuck between the two, right? But anyway, you're having a series of votes, one in 2006, the next in 2009, then you have another one in 2014, and then the final one, most recent one, was in 2017, right? Now, in each of these different referendums, right, is a thing where two things, right? First of all, you end up having majorities of people who are in favour of independence. And then the second thing is that in all these cases, it ends up being a very low voter turnout. Now, Spain in general tends to have, relatively high voter turnout and stuff, and also like the region of Catalonia also has quite a high turnout, right? So it's not something within the culture of the Spanish or within the Catalans themselves to not turn out when there's a vote. However, for these independence referendums, the turnout ends up being very, very low. So for instance, if we look at the one in 2014, it ended up being a thing where 81% of people voted for independence. And then the one in 2017, you end up having a situation where 92% of people vote for independence. However, the turnout for the first case was 42%, and the turnout for the second one was 43%. So clearly there's not a majority in favour of independence. And so one has to ask the question, why is the turnout so low in these kind of elections, right? Well, the fact is that it's obviously going to be quite low because the people who are really in favour of it, they're going to turn out to vote no matter what. And then the people who are against it will be like, I'm against it. And also, I don't even need to turn out to vote because it's non-binding, it's unconstitutional, it will never happen anyway. So even if we all turn out to vote and whatever, it's still not going to make a difference. Like you could have like 99%, you could have 100% turnout, and still it's not going to be allowed, right? So what's the point in even turning out to vote? And especially in 2017, there end up being crackdowns, right? So the Spanish police, like kind of the Guard Nacional, I think that's what they're called. They end up like cracking down. You see like really brutal kind of like videos and like images and stuff of Spanish police really cracking down on things and not allowing the people to go to the polling stations, right? However, on the flip side, the Catalonian police, they stood back and they allowed like people to vote and stuff. So again, there's this kind of like tension, and also as well the leaders, like kind of like who were behind this. Many of them end up having to flee, or some of them were arrested, etc., etc. So quite a nasty kind of level of like repression. Obviously, not as bad as it has been in other places around the world, but it still is quite like this is not really that good and stuff. You're kind of holding people kind of against their will, and obviously it's one of those things where with any kind of thing, when it's independence, right, there's going to be some people in favor of it and some people are against it. So again, even if Catalonia got its independence, there's a number of people, especially as we said within Barcelona, who feel more Spanish than Catalan, right? So it's all the kind of complications from that. But anyway, this video now is going to focus on the what if, right? So what would have happened, first of all, what would have had to have gone differently? And second of all, what would be the consequences if Catalonia got its independence? Say, for instance, if they got its independence in 2017, And yeah, that's what we're going to look at now. Right, now before I get into what if is, yeah, right, I just want to say this massive disclaimer. In the comment section, don't just I've learned from the Irish one, I've learned from other videos, stay out of things, and no matter what, people are going to be like, oh, you're biased and blah, blah, blah. Just I don't care. Okay, I'm giving you the information here. You decide what you want with it. I'm not. If Catalonia is independent or if it's not independent, it doesn't bother me. So please, in the comment section, leave a comment, leave a nice comment. Thank you, this nice video, etc. Oh, you missed out this little thing. That's cool, whatever. But don't start trying to embroil me in this whole debate, because it's just okay. Now we've got that out of the way, that massive disclaimer. Now we can talk about the kind of what ifs, right? So first of all, obviously, like, it got cracked down on in our own timeline in 2017. But let's say that movement and how it gets cracked down leads to a snowball effect, and there ends up being a huge spike in the number of people who want independence. And then it just kind of goes from there, and eventually they end up just actually enforcing their unilateral Declaration of Independence, right? Now, first of all, how Spain would react to that, I don't know whether they'd necessarily send in the troops and stuff. It might, I don't know how serious they are about their constitutional thing. I don't know, right? But let's just assume that it's just a peaceful thing, but it's still a very tense kind of breakaway, right? Now, what would be the consequence of this is manyfold, right? So first of all, obviously, with regard to Spain itself, so obviously Spain would be smaller. It would lose many millions of people. It would lose one of its most prosperous regions, because Catalonia contributes more to the Spanish coffers than it does get in return. And well, at least at the moment, right? It has low levels of unemployment. Its economy is doing better than the rest of Spain. So there's an argument that you can kind of say that oh, actually Catalonia would be doing quite well by itself, in terms of independence. However, what we already saw from the instability in 2017 is a number of businesses end up leaving the region, and many of those have still not returned, right? So any kind of instability when it comes to it, you see the same with Brexit, you see the same with all these different things, right? You end up having a dip down when it comes to independence, because independence is a messy thing, it's a confusing thing, and businesses like certainty, right? Until until the dust settles, they don't really want to be there in the middle of all this kind of political turmoil, right? So more likely than not, you end up having a short-term loss of economic growth. And the thing is, it's as we said, with the video about Brexit and Ireland and America and etc., it's a thing where independence in all cases is like a 50-year kind of project, right? You're not going to be able to tell straight away whether it was a good decision, breaking away or not. It's something which in the long term you look back on and go, okay, this was a good decision to make. But the thing is, in the short term, well, if anything, there's trade-offs, as we always say, the thing that Thomas Sowell said, right? There's no solutions, only trade-offs, right? So it's going to be all very complicated about the large number of people within Catalonia who want to remain Spanish, and then vice versa. There's going to be Catalans in other part of Spain, and it's all very confusing, and so you're already going to have those kind of issues. Then on top of that, there's the issue of the EU, right? So obviously, you see the same thing with Scotland, right? Scotland breaking away means that it still is not guaranteed whether it'd be accepted within the EU, right? And the reason for this is because the EU, in order to become a member, you need to have unanimous support. And many countries within the EU have regions within them, Spain obviously being the most prominent of them, right? They don't want there to be secessionist movements, right? And so allowing a secessionist movement within an existing EU country, and then allowing that country to, allowing the breakaway country to become part of the EU, sets a precedent that other countries can do that, other regions within countries can do that. So for instance, Belgium, you have Wallonia, which is predominantly French, and then French speaking, and then you have Flanders, which is predominantly Dutch speaking or Flemish speaking. And so these two regions, they already want independence. If they see Catalonia, they'll go, okay, cool. then obviously again with Scotland, the push for Scottish independence, that will kind of like increase as well. Also in Germany, you've got Bavaria, which like some people they want to split away, and even within Spain itself, the Basque people have been wanting like independence for a long time. They're also going to really be pushing for it. So it would set a domino effect across the whole of Europe, and also as well within the whole rest of the world, right? Because the whole rest of the world, there's multiple different independence movements, and if they see a country like like Spain basically like fall apart, then they'll be like, well, we can break away as well, right? If Catalonia gets its independence, we can also get our independence as well. And then, of course, as well, with regards to the EU, there's also the complications of, like Catalonia at the moment, Spain at the moment uses the euro. It's part of Schengen. It's part of it's part of the single market. All these kind of things, right? If they just split away, are they still going to be allowed to have all these things still, right? That's complicated. And then, say for instance, with the euro thing, it's like, do they continue to illegally use it? There's some countries in the Balkans which shouldn't be part of the Eurozone, but actually are like part of the Eurozone, like they use the euro. Maybe Catalonia does this, but then how long would the EU kind of allow this for, right? And then, if they don't end up having the euro, then what currency do they have to make up their own currency? Are they going to have to like use the dollar? A lot of countries in like emergency states, they end up having to use the US dollar as like a kind of common currency. So it's all very complicated, right? And never mind, obviously, the relationship between Catalonia and Spain is going to be very tense for a long time. Business is going to be hurt, trade is going to be hurt, etc. So it'd all be very complicated, right? It's not to say that they couldn't, and it's not to say, but it still is a recognition that it's, as with all independence cases, it's not a straightforward thing. And the fact that I think the only way this could be avoided, like a lot of the worst things of it being avoided, is if going back to 1978, if they hadn't put that bit in where secession is unconstitutional, because I don't think any country should have that within its thing. Any region within a country ought to be able to split away if it wants. And I know I'm going to get a lot of like stick in the comment section for that, but that's a principle I genuinely believe in, and I apply it even to my own country as well. So anyway, so that's some of the things to kind of take in consideration with all of that. And regardless of like whether like Catalonia stays as part of Spain or whether it gets its independence, I wish both the people of Catalonia and the rest of Spain all the best, right? So whatever you guys decide, that's what's going to happen. So if you enjoyed that video, don't forget to obviously hit the like button, share with your friends as well, sharing is caring. Also subscribe, as we said before, subscribe if you haven't already. Yes you who watch every single one of my videos and hasn't subscribed yet, what are you doing? Just help me to help you, like just subscribe, okay? And then also the next video is going to be on Malthus. So what if the economist Malthus was correct, right? So he obviously had like Malthusian economics, which is basically to do with like the population rising and then like the supply of food like decreasing. And so we're going to basically be like, what if he ended up being right? Because history has proven him wrong, but we're going to imagine what the world would be like if he was actually correct. So with that being said, have a great day and bye.